Today we're going to be talking about composition in photography. Now, first things first, I don't hold a degree in photography, and this video is mostly related with my ideas and thoughts that I've taken from books, from years of photographing, from conversations with other photographers, from observing other photographers at work or their work, and from obviously making YouTube videos about other photographers, which always lets me dive deep into their techniques, what their thoughts were, and reading interviews about them. And obviously, it's a great source of learning for me. And so, what we're going to be doing today is basically breaking down questions related to composition or about composition, and we're going to try and answer them in an open perspective, in a way that while watching this video, you can kind of like be reminded of some of the basics, but also reminded to keep a fresh and open perspective towards new knowledge and new things in life. And especially when it comes to composition in photography, we need to be very clear-headed and always open to new things. And so I guess that it's been all for introductions. And so why don't you just grab a drink, make yourself comfortable, and let's go straight to another video while we're going to be exploring the ins and outs of composition in photography. Now, I remember first learning about composition or hearing about it when I was in a drawing class, and I must have been about 12. And my teacher was on about drawing in 3D and dimension and composition. And I remember thinking about all these things and asking myself, but what exactly is composition? How can you master it? But most importantly, how can you achieve the perfect composition, or like the closest thing possible? And now that I look back at my younger self, I'd have quite a few things to say. And I can say that even though composition or composition in photography can be described as how a photographer arranges elements in a frame, the truth is that composition to me is a decision, conscious or not, about how to capture a reality, whether that is a constructed reality in a studio or something we stage and we're photographing, or a non-constructed one, meaning the real world and what surrounds us. And there is no such thing as the perfect composition because it's all very relative and, more importantly, subjective to each and every one of us, our thoughts, our feelings, and our knowledge. We can definitely say that photos like Cartier-Bresson's The Cyclist or Eugene Smith's A Nun Waiting for Survivors are true examples of great compositions. But having photography an artistic dimension, it also makes it all very subjective to interpretation. Because what is perfect to me might not be perfect to you. So the key here is to keep an open mind when it comes to judging a composition or composing a photo ourselves. And I'm sure at some point in time you must have heard about rules. Rules in composition and whether you should obey them or not. And the question here is not really if you should obey rules or if you should discard them. I think the answer is just be you. I'm going to give you my example. Personally, I am someone who sort of like, I don't break down my images before I go and photograph them. I sort of absorb the place and I like to feel things. I'm going by feeling a lot of the time and I just go with the flow. One thing that I do though, and that is, whether if it's what piqued my interest is visually speaking or in terms of like how it made me feel, is that I try to visualize a final image. I tried to visualize my intention. And this is something I've learned with Ansel Adams, and he did this with all his images pretty much, and it worked really well for him. And it's something that I've learned with him, to learn to visualize what I want. And in this case, Ansel Adams did it in a visual form, and I do it in a sort of visual but also like psychological form if I don't have like a concrete or solid visual idea. And once I know what's my point of interest, what is that, I want from there, I sort of like go and then pick up my camera and just try and find different angles and try and find what I want with my camera. But this is an important exercise that I do. I think like if you sort of stop your being in the moment sort of zone in your head, it can be quite, disruptive for your creative process to constantly think about rules and whether if you're doing this right or wrong. I think you should just go with the flow and believe a bit in yourself. And if it comes out wrong, it comes out wrong and you're going to try again. And so briefly discussing the rule of thirds. With this rule, you basically have to divide your image into 3 different sections, horizontal and vertically, which creates 6 equal spaces in the image. And this rule states that the 4 points where these lines intersect are the points of interest. So ideally, you'll have to place your subject in or in between these points. Another interesting rule is the rule of odds, which basically states that if you frame your subject between 2 other elements, thus creating the odd number of 3, it suggests a visual balance or harmony. Now, leaving the debate of rules or no rules on the side, really, I'm going to be leaving that one to you. It's up to you if you want to follow rules religiously or not. I am not that religious about them, but everyone with their own ideas and their own, opinions, and I respect that. But anyways, going back to the center of the video, which is learning about composition. How can we master composition? What things can we use to help us understand composition and learn and try to be more organic to us, to look at somewhere or someplace and just sort of like, make it easier for us to compose around what we have. And for me, there are a couple of things, or more than a couple of things, I'd say 5 different aspects that I'm going to be talking about. However, before I go into them, and I'm going to be showing you some images that I've taken and sort of like as examples so we can understand a bit better what I'm talking about, I'm going to be doing a follow-up video to this one where I'm going to be deciding between 5 or 6 different sort of like techniques of composition that I've used or that I've learned. And we're going to be discussing all of these things more in depth. So this is going to be a brief note. And the first thing that can help us while composing, or the first technique that I'd like to say, is understanding lines and shapes. When we're walking around, we can definitely see how things interact with one another. Cars, people, movement, motion. And in these interactions, there are lines that are created. They are, of course, invisible, but that in composition can help us immensely by creating different areas of interest in the image, or even helping in accentuating our main point of interest. And we can use these interactions everywhere. If we walk through a quiet neighborhood, we can see the lines created by houses, electrical cables, trees, and in seeing these shapes and interactions, and see what they bring, and admire their visual interest and see what relationship they can create with one another, it can definitely be helpful into establishing a composition. Now, an interesting element or technique that we can use is composing around space. And I have to say, though, that this is a very personal perspective on space. And when I talk about space in composition, my perspective is using space as a defining element for our composition, whether we are in an open or enclosed space, or using architectural elements themselves to help us in our composition. So here's an example of 2 images I've taken in different locations. The first one is a photo of my cousin Michael, which I took near my house, and I used 3 branches as a sort of frame here, placing him exactly where I wanted. And the next image is totally different. I captured this image on a beach in Skegness, where I essentially used the openness of the space in my favor, because here we have 3 different elements, the birds, the people, and the wind turbines very close to each other in this immense open space. But this last image is also an example of composing with depth. And while looking at this image, we can definitely uncover 4 different areas in it. The first one being the sand, which is the closer to us, so it's kind of like a foreground. And the second area would be around the birds, the third where the people are sitting, and the fourth and more distant one, the wind turbines area. And I have to admit that depth is one of my favorite ways to compose, and I do try and construct this in a lot of my photos, because depth usually has a sort of leading line that pulls the viewer's eye towards a focal point, which is usually where my main point of interest is. Now, another aspect I can talk about in terms of composition is color. And I touched composing with color in my last episode of Film Diaries, where I basically decided at some point kind of like use colors as a guide, and I started organizing my composition around those colors and how they sort of complemented or not each other. And when it comes to composing with color, we can talk about complementary colors, contrasting colors, or a sort of color explosion, which makes the image visually appealing. And an example of this can be this photo I took in Brighton with my Leica M6, and there's three main dominant colors here: the blue, the yellow, and red. And lastly, composing with feeling is like turning a sort of blind eye and going with the flow, with what you're feeling at the moment. And in my experience, this is a instinct-based action. And when I do this, I sort of don't think too much about lines and other things, and I usually just snap and do it very fast. And the last question before we close this video is kind of like what sources there are for you to learn about composition. Now we've talked about the process of learning, but now we're talking about something different, which is like where can you take these visual lessons? And we've talked about in the past learning through observation and how important it is to sort of like not just attend classes and be in college. You don't necessarily have to have formal education to learn all of this, but you need to have experience. And you need to keep an open mind and an open eye, because composition can be everywhere. You know, you don't necessarily have to have a beautiful, stunning place in order to take a good photo. And you can have like simple things like forks or knives or utensils, and you can create like really beautiful compositions. Now, touching the work of other photographers, that is a good source for you to learn more about composition. The work of other photographers, photo books, also very visual and a bit more out there, because not everyone really likes this sort of thing. But if you look at comics or graphic novels, they're also a very good source, because you'll see how the sequencing of the images sort of like, it's kind of like watching a movie but break it down on a storyboard. So basically you have all the compositions there. But of course you also have other examples such as movies. And when we talk about movies, you have the most recent movies, but you can also have very classical movies. And I personally prefer watching classical movies because I do have a sort of like passion for old movies, and I like to learn from directors that didn't have experienced necessarily the freedom we have these days in terms of composition and in terms of like camera movements and whatnot. But there's all other things that you can go through, for instance, painting. Some of my favorite painters, such as Caravaggio, Edward Hopper, you can learn so much from them in terms of composition. Hopper especially is a great painter, one of my favorites. And yeah, I guess that there's a world of sources that you can sort of like check. You can go and get books from your library. You can look for it online, you can look for documentaries, you can do so many things, or you can learn about composition. It's all about, again, experiencing things. And yeah, I guess that it's been all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful, and I hope it wasn't too boring or too long. I'm assuming that it's going to be a bit longer than usual, but I hope it is helpful, and I hope that it is inspiring. And I guess that it's been all for today, so thank you so much for watching. I'm going to be leaving links down below to my print shop, to my work, so if you'd like to grab a print, let me know. I'll be very grateful for that. And but most importantly for me, I'm grateful for, you know, your support and for watching. I think that's the most important thing. It really, really does fill my heart. And I guess that I'll see you here for another video very soon, so stay safe, keep shooting film, and peace.